Chapter 13 of The Haunted Hotel, A Mystery of Modern Venice. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kehinde. The Haunted Hotel by Wilkie Collins. Chapter 13. In the spring of the year 1861, Agnes was established at the country seat of her two friends, now promoted, on the death of the first lord, without offspring, to be the new Lord and Lady Montbarry. The old nurse was not separated from her mistress. A place suited to her time of life had been found for her in the pleasant Irish household. She was perfectly happy in her new sphere, and she spent her first half year's dividend from the Venice Hotel Company with characteristic prodigality in presents for the children. Early in the year, also, the directors of the life insurance offices submitted to circumstances, and paid the £10,000. Immediately afterwards, the widow of the first Lady Montbarry, otherwise the Dowager Lady Montbarry, left England with Baron Rivar for the United States. The Baron's object was announced in the scientific columns of the newspapers to be investigation into the present state of experimental chemistry in the great American Republic. His sister informed inquiring friends that she accompanied him in the hope of finding consolation in change of scene after the bereavement that had fallen on her. Hearing this news from Henry Westwick, then paying a visit at his brother's house, Agnes was conscious of a certain sense of relief. "With the Atlantic between us," she said, "surely I have done with that terrible woman now." Barely a week passed before those words had been spoken, before an event happened which reminded Agnes of the terrible woman once more. On that day, Henry's engagements had obliged him to return to London. He had ventured, on the morning of his departure, to press his suit once more on Agnes, and the children, as he had anticipated, proved to be innocent obstacles in the way of his success. On the other hand, he had privately secured a firm ally in his sister in law. "Have a little patience," the new Lady Montbarry had said, "and leave me to turn the influence of the children in the right direction. If they can persuade her to listen to you, they shall." The two ladies had accompanied Henry and some other guests who went away at the same time to the railway station, and had just driven back to the house, when the servant announced that a person of the name of Roland was waiting to see her ladyship. "Is it a woman?" "Yes, my lady." Young Lady Montbarry turned to Agnes. "This is the very person," she said, "whom your lawyer thought likely to help him when he was trying to trace the lost courier." "You don't mean the English maid who was with Lady Montbarry at Venice?" "My dear, don't speak of Montbarry's horrid widow by the name which is my name now. Stephen and I have arranged to call her by her foreign title before she was married. I am Lady Montbarry, and she is the Countess. In that way there will be no confusion. Yes, Mrs. Roland was in my service before she became the Countess's maid. She was a perfectly trustworthy person, with one defect that obliged me to send her away, a sullen temper which led to perpetual complaints of her in the servants' hall. Would you like to see her?" Agnes accepted the proposal, in the faint hope of getting some information for the courier's wife. The complete defeat of every attempt to trace the lost man had been accepted as final by Mrs. Ferrari. She had deliberately arrayed herself in widow's mourning, and was earning her livelihood in an employment which the unwearied kindness of Agnes had procured for her in London. The last chance of penetrating the mystery of Ferrari's disappearance seemed to rest now on what Ferrari's former fellow servant might be able to tell. With highly wrought expectations, Agnes followed her friend into the room in which Mrs. Roland was waiting. A tall bony woman, in the autumn of life, with sunken eyes and iron grey hair, rose stiffly from her chair, and saluted the ladies with stern submission as they opened the door. A person of unblemished character evidently, but not without visible drawbacks. Big bushy eyebrows, an awfully deep and solemn voice, a harsh unbending manner, a complete absence in her figure of the undulating lines characteristic of the sex, presented virtue in this excellent person under its least alluring aspect. Strangers, on a first introduction to her, were accustomed to wonder why she was not a man. "Are you pretty well, Mrs. Rolland?" "I am as well as I can expect to be, my lady, at my time of life." "Is there anything I can do for you?" "Your ladyship can do me a great favour if you will please speak to my character while I was in your service. I am offered a place to wait on an invalid lady who has lately come to live in this neighbourhood." "Ah, yes, I have heard of her, a Mrs. Carbury, with a very pretty niece, I am told. But, Mrs. Rolland, you left my service some time ago. Mrs. Carbury will surely expect you to refer to the last mistress by whom you were employed." A flash of virtuous indignation irradiated Mrs. Rolland's sunken eyes. She coughed before she answered, as if her last mistress stuck in her throat. "I have explained to Mrs. Carbury, my lady, that the person I last served I really cannot give her her title in your ladyship's presence has left England for America. Mrs. Carbury knows that I quitted the person of my own free will, and knows why, and approves of my conduct so far. A word from your ladyship will be amply sufficient to get me the situation." "Very well, Mrs. Rolland. I have no objection to be your reference, under the circumstances. Mrs. Carbury will find me at home to morrow until 2 o'clock." "Mrs. Carbury is not well enough to leave the house, my lady. Her niece, Miss Haldane, will call and make the inquiries, if your ladyship has no objections." "I have not the least objection. The pretty niece carries her own welcome with her. Wait a minute, Mrs. Rolland. This lady is Miss Lockwood, my husband's cousin and my friend. She is anxious to speak to you about the courier who was in the late Lord Montbarry's service at Venice." Mrs. Rolland's bushy eyebrows frowned in stern disapproval of the new topic of conversation. "I regret to hear it, my lady," was all she said. "Perhaps you have not been informed of what happened after you left Venice?" Agnes ventured to add. "Ferrari left the palace secretly, and he has never been heard of since." Mrs. Rolland mysteriously closed her eyes, as if to exclude some vision of the lost courier which was of a nature to disturb a respectable woman. "Nothing that Mr. Ferrari could do would surprise me," she replied, in her deepest bass tones. "You speak rather harshly of him," said Agnes. Mrs. Rolland suddenly opened her eyes again. "I speak harshly of nobody without reason," she said. "Mr. Ferrari behaved to me, Miss Lockwood, as no man living has ever behaved before or since." "What did he do?" Mrs. Rolland answered with a stony stare of horror. "He took liberties with me." Young Lady Montbarry suddenly turned aside and put her handkerchief over her mouth in convulsions of suppressed laughter. Mrs. Rolland went on with a grim enjoyment of the bewilderment which her reply had produced in Agnes. "And when I insisted on an apology, Miss, he had the audacity to say that the life at the palace was dull, and he didn't know how else to amuse himself." "I am afraid I have hardly made myself understood," said Agnes. "I am not speaking to you out of any interest in Ferrari. Are you aware that he is married?" "I pity his wife," said Mrs. Rolland. "She is naturally in great grief about him," Agnes proceeded. "She ought to thank God she is rid of him," Mrs. Rolland interposed. Agnes still persisted. "I have known Mrs. Ferrari from her childhood, and I am sincerely anxious to help her in this matter. Did you notice anything, while you were at Venice, that would account for her husband's extraordinary disappearance? On what sort of terms, for instance, did he live with his master and mistress?" "On terms of familiarity with his mistress," said Mrs. Rolland, "which were simply sickening to a respectable English servant. She used to encourage him to talk to her about all his affairs, how he got on with his wife, and how pressed he was for money, and such like, just as if they were equals. Contemptible, that's what I call it." "And his master," Agnes continued. "How did Ferrari get on with Lord Montbarry?" "My lord used to live shut up with his studies and his sorrows," Mrs. Rolland answered, with a hard solemnity expressive of respect for his lordship's memory. Mr. Ferrari got his money when it was due, and he cared for nothing else. If I could afford it, I would leave the place too, but I can't afford it. Those were the last words he said to me, on the morning when I left the palace. I made no reply. After what had happened on that other occasion, I was naturally not on speaking terms with Mr. Ferrari." "Can you really tell me nothing which will throw any light on this matter?" "Nothing," said Mrs. Rolland, with an undisguised relish of the disappointment that she was inflicting. "There was another member of the family at Venice," Agnes resumed, determined to sift the question to the bottom while she had the chance. "There was Baron Rivar." Mrs. Rolland lifted her large hands, covered with rusty black gloves, in mute protest against the introduction of Baron Rivar as a subject of inquiry. "Are you aware, miss," she began, "that I left my place in consequence of what I observed?" Agnes stopped her there. "I only wanted to ask," she explained, "if anything was said or done by Baron Rivar which might account for Ferrari's strange conduct." "Nothing that I know of," said Mrs. Rolland. "The Baron and Mr. Ferrari, if I may use such an expression, were birds of a feather, so far as I could see. I mean, one was as unprincipled as the other. I am a just woman, and I will give you an example. Only the day before I left, I heard the Baron say, through the open door of his room, while I was passing along the corridor, 'Ferrari, I want £1,000. What would you do for £1,000?' And I heard Mr. Ferrari answer, 'Anything, sir, as long as I was not found out.' And then they both burst out laughing. I heard no more than that. Judge for yourself, miss." Agnes reflected for a moment. £1,000 was the sum that had been sent to Mrs. Ferrari in the anonymous letter. Was that enclosure in any way connected, as a result, with the conversation between the Baron and Ferrari? It was useless to press any more inquiries on Mrs. Rolland. She could give no further information which was of the slightest importance to the object in view. There was no alternative but to grant her dismissal. One more effort had been made to find a trace of the lost man, and once again the effort had failed. They were a family party at the dinner table that day. The only guest left in the house was a nephew of the new Lord Montbarry, the eldest son of his sister, Lady Barville. Lady Montbarry could not resist telling the story of the first and last attack made on the virtue of Mrs. Rolland, with a comically exact imitation of Mrs. Rolland's deep and dismal voice. Being asked by her husband what was the object which had brought that formidable person to the house, she naturally mentioned the expected visit of Mrs. Haldane. Arthur Barville, unusually silent and preoccupied so far, suddenly struck into the conversation with a burst of enthusiasm. "Miss Haldane is the most charming girl in all Ireland," he said. "I caught sight of her yesterday over the wall of her garden, as I was riding by. What time is she coming to morrow? Before 2? I'll look into the drawing room by accident. I am dying to be introduced to her." Agnes was amused by his enthusiasm. "Are you in love with Miss Haldane already?" she asked. Arthur answered gravely, "It's no joking matter. I have been all day at the garden wall waiting to see her again. It depends on Miss Haldane to make me the happiest or the wretchedest man living." "You foolish boy! How can you talk such nonsense?" He was talking nonsense, undoubtedly. But, if Agnes had only known it, he was doing something more than that. He was innocently leading her another stage nearer on the way to Venice. End of chapter 13. Recording by Kehinde of BadTrek.com. 14 of The Haunted Hotel, A Mystery of Modern Venice. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kehinde. The Haunted Hotel by Wilkie Collins. Chapter 14. As the summer months advanced, the transformation of the Venetian palace into the modern hotel proceeded rapidly towards completion. The outside of the building, with its fine Palladian front looking on the canal, was wisely left unaltered. Inside, as a matter of necessity, the rooms were almost rebuilt, so far at least as the size and the arrangement of them were concerned. The vast saloons were partitioned off into apartments containing 3 or 4 rooms each. The broad corridors in the upper regions afforded spare space enough for rows of little bedchambers devoted to servants and to travellers with limited means. Nothing was spared but the solid floors and the finely carved ceilings. These last, in excellent preservation as to workmanship, merely required cleaning and regilding here and there, to add greatly to the beauty and importance of the best rooms in the hotel. The only exception to the complete reorganization of the interior was at one extremity of the edifice, on the first and second floors. Here there happened in each case to be rooms of such comparatively moderate size, and so attractively decorated, that the architect suggested leaving them as they were. It was afterwards discovered that these were no other than the apartments formerly occupied by Lord Montbarry on the first floor, and by Baron Rivar on the second. The room in which Montbarry had died was still fitted up as a bedroom, and was now distinguished as number 14. The room above it, in which the Baron had slept, took its place on the hotel register as number 38. With the ornaments on the walls and ceilings cleaned and brightened up, and with the heavy old fashioned beds, chairs, and tables replaced by bright, pretty, and luxurious modern furniture, these two promised to be at once the most attractive and the most comfortable bedchambers in the hotel. As for the once desolate and disused ground floor of the building, it was now transformed, by means of splendid dining rooms, reception rooms, billiard rooms, and smoking rooms, into a palace by itself. Even the dungeon like vaults beneath, now lighted and ventilated on the most approved modern plan, had been turned, as if by magic, into kitchens, servants' offices, ice rooms, and wine cellars, worthy of the splendour of the grandest hotel in Italy, in the now bygone period of 17 years since. Passing from the lapse of the summer months at Venice to the lapse of the summer months in Ireland, it is next to be recorded that Mrs. Roland obtained the situation of attendant on the invalid Mrs. Carbury, and that the fair Miss Haldane, like a female Caesar, came, saw, and conquered, on her first day's visit to the new Lord Montbarry's house. The ladies were as loud in her praises as Arthur Barville himself. Lord Montbarry declared that she was the only perfectly pretty woman he had ever seen who was really unconscious of her own attractions. The old nurse said she looked as if she had just stepped out of a picture, and wanted nothing but a gilt frame round her to make her complete. Miss Haldane, on her side, returned from her first visit to the Montbarrys, charmed with her new acquaintances. Later on the same day Arthur called with an offering of fruit and flowers for Mrs. Carbury, and with instructions to ask if she was well enough to receive Lord and Lady Montbarry and Miss Lockwood on the morrow. In a week's time the two households were on the friendliest terms. Mrs. Carbury, confined to the sofa by a spinal malady, had been hitherto dependent on her niece for one of the few pleasures she could enjoy, the pleasure of having the best new novels read to her as they came out. Discovering this, Arthur volunteered to relieve Miss Haldane at intervals in the office of reader. He was clever at mechanical contrivances of all sorts, and he introduced improvements in Mrs. Carbury's couch, and in the means of conveying her from the bedchamber to the drawing room, which alleviated the poor lady's sufferings and brightened her gloomy life. With these claims on the gratitude of the aunt, aided by the personal advantages which he unquestionably possessed, Arthur advanced rapidly in the favour of the charming niece. She was, it is needless to say, perfectly well aware that he was in love with her, while he was himself modestly reticent on the subject, so far as words went. But she was not equally quick in penetrating the nature of her own feelings towards Arthur. Watching the two young people with keen powers of observation necessarily concentrated on them by the complete seclusion of her life, the invalid lady discovered signs of roused sensibility in Miss Haldane, when Arthur was present, which had never yet shown themselves in her social relations with other admirers eager to pay their addresses to her. Having drawn her own conclusions in private, Mrs. Carbury took the first favourable opportunity, in Arthur's interests, of putting them to the test. "I don't know what I shall do," she said one day, "when Arthur goes away." Miss Haldane looked up quickly from her work. "Surely he is not going to leave us?" she exclaimed. "My dear, he has already stayed at his uncle's house a month longer than he intended. His father and mother naturally expect to see him at home again." Miss Haldane met this difficulty with a suggestion which could only have proceeded from a judgment already disturbed by the ravages of the tender passion. "Why can't his father and mother go and see him at Lord Montbarry's?" she asked. "Sir Theodore's place is only 30 miles away, and Lady Barville is Lord Montbarry's sister. They needn't stand on ceremony." "They may have other engagements," Mrs. Carbury remarked. "My dear aunt, we don't know that. Suppose you ask Arthur." "Suppose you ask him." Miss Haldane bent her head again over her work. Suddenly as it was done, her aunt had seen her face, and her face betrayed her. When Arthur came the next day, Mrs. Carbury said a word to him in private while her niece was in the garden. The last new novel lay neglected on the table. Arthur followed Miss Haldane into the garden. The next day he wrote home, enclosing in his letter a photograph of Miss Haldane. Before the end of the week, Sir Theodore and Lady Barville arrived at Lord Montbarry's, and formed their own judgment of the fidelity of the portrait. They had themselves married early in life, and, strange to say, they did not object on principle to the early marriages of other people. The question of age being thus disposed of, the course of true love had no other obstacles to encounter. Miss Haldane was an only child, and was possessed of an ample fortune. Arthur's career at the university had been creditable, but certainly not brilliant enough to present his withdrawal in the light of a disaster. As Sir Theodore's eldest son, his position was already made for him. He was 22 years of age, and the young lady was 18. There was really no producible reason for keeping the lovers waiting, and no excuse for deferring the wedding day beyond the first week in September. In the interval, while the bride and bridegroom would be necessarily absent on the inevitable tour abroad, a sister of Mrs. Carbury volunteered to stay with her during the temporary separation from her niece. On the conclusion of the honeymoon, the young couple were to return to Ireland, and were to establish themselves in Mrs. Carbury's spacious and comfortable home. These arrangements were decided upon early in the month of August. About the same date, the last alterations in the old palace at Venice were completed. The rooms were dried by steam, the cellars were stocked, the manager collected round him his army of skilled servants, and the new hotel was advertised all over Europe to open in October. End of chapter 14. Recording by Kehinde of bartrek.com. Of the Haunted Hotel, A Mystery of Modern Venice. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kehinde. The Haunted Hotel by Wilkie Collins. Chapter 15. Miss Agnes Lockwood to Mrs. Ferrari. I promised to give you some account, dear Emily, of the marriage of Mr. Arthur Barville and Miss Haldane. It took place 10 days since, but I have had so many things to look after in the absence of the master and mistress of this house, that I am only able to write to you today. The invitations to the wedding were limited to members of the families on either side in consideration of the ill health of Miss Haldane's aunt. On the side of the Montbarry family there were present, besides Lord and Lady Montbarry, Sir Theodore and Lady Barville, Mrs. Norbury, whom you may remember as his lordship's second sister, and Mr. Francis Westwick and Mr. Henry Westwick. The three children and I attended the ceremony as bridesmaids. We were joined by two young ladies, cousins of the bride, and very agreeable girls. Our dresses were white, trimmed with green in honour of Ireland, and we each had a handsome gold bracelet given to us as a present from the bridegroom. If you add to the persons whom I have already mentioned, the elder members of Mrs. Carbury's family, and the old servants in both houses, privileged to drink the healths of the married pair at the lower end of the room, you will have the list of the company at the wedding breakfast complete. The weather was perfect, and the ceremony, with music, was beautifully performed. As for the bride, no words can describe how lovely she looked, or how well she went through it all. We were very merry at the breakfast, and the speeches went off on the whole quite well enough. The last speech, before the party broke up, was made by Mr. Henry Westwick, and was the best of all. He offered a happy suggestion at the end which has produced a very unexpected change in my life here. As well as I remember, he concluded in these words: "On one point we are all agreed. We are sorry that the parting hour is near, and we should be glad to meet again. Why should we not meet again? This is the autumn time of the year. We are most of us leaving home for the holidays. What do you say, if you have no engagements that will prevent it, to joining our young married friends before the close of their tour, and renewing the social success of this delightful breakfast by another festival in honour of the honeymoon? The bride and bridegroom are going to Germany and the Tyrol, on their way to Italy. I propose that we allow them a month to themselves, and that we arrange to meet them afterwards in the north of Italy, say at Venice." This proposal was received with great applause, which was changed into shouts of laughter by no less a person than my dear old nurse. The moment Mr. Westwick pronounced the word Venice, she started up among the servants at the lower end of the room, and called out at the top of her voice, "Go to our hotel, ladies and gentlemen! We get 6% on our money already, and if you will only crowd the place and call for the best of everything, it will be 10% in our pockets in no time. Ask Master Henry." Appealed to in this irresistible manner, Mr. Westwick had no choice but to explain that he was concerned as a shareholder in a new hotel company at Venice, and that he had invested a small sum of money for the nurse, not very considerately as I think, in the speculation. Hearing this, the company, by way of humouring the joke, drank a new toast: success to the nurse's hotel, and a speedy rise in the dividend. When the conversation returned in due time to the more serious question of the proposed meeting at Venice, difficulties began to present themselves, caused of course by invitations for the autumn which many of the guests had already accepted. Only two members of Mrs. Carbury's family were at liberty to keep the proposed appointment. On our side, we were more at leisure to do as we pleased. Mr. Henry Westwick decided to go to Venice in advance of the rest, to test the accommodation of the new hotel on the opening day. Mrs. Norbury and Mr. Francis Westwick volunteered to follow him, and, after some persuasion, Lord and Lady Montbarry consented to a species of compromise. His lordship could not conveniently spare time enough for the journey to Venice, but he and Lady Montbarry arranged to accompany Mrs. Norbury and Mr. Francis Westwick as far on their way to Italy as Paris. 5 days since they took their departure to meet their travelling companions in London, leaving me here in charge of the three dear children. They begged hard, of course, to be taken with papa and mamma, but it was thought better not to interrupt the progress of their education, and not to expose them, especially the two younger girls, to the fatigues of travelling. I have had a charming letter from the bride this morning, dated Cologne. You cannot think how artlessly and prettily she assures me of her happiness. Some people, as they say in Ireland, are born to good luck, and I think Arthur Barville is one of them. When you next write, I hope to hear that you are in better health and spirits, and that you continue to like your employment. Believe me, sincerely your friend, A. L. Agnes had just closed and directed her letter, when the eldest of her three pupils entered the room with the startling announcement that Lord Montbarry's travelling servant had arrived from Paris. Alarmed by the idea that some misfortune had happened, she ran out to meet the man in the hall. Her face told him how seriously he had frightened her, before she could speak. "There's nothing wrong, miss," he hastened to say. "My lord and my lady are enjoying themselves at Paris. They only want you and the young ladies to be with them." Saying these amazing words, he handed to Agnes a letter from Lady Montbarry. "Dearest Agnes," she read, "I am so charmed with the delightful change in my life. It is 6 years, remember, since I last travelled on the Continent, that I have exerted all my fascinations to persuade Lord Montbarry to go on to Venice. And, what is more to the purpose, I have actually succeeded. He has just gone to his room to write the necessary letters of excuse in time for the post to England. May you have as good a husband, my dear, when your time comes. In the meanwhile, the one thing wanting now to make my happiness complete is to have you and the darling children with us. Montbarry is just as miserable without them as I am, though he doesn't confess it so freely. You will have no difficulties to trouble you. Louise will deliver these hurried lines, and will take care of you on the journey to Paris. Kiss the children for me 1,000 times, and never mind their education for the present. Pack up instantly, my dear, and I will be fonder of you than ever. Your affectionate friend, Adela Montbarry." Agnes folded up the letter, and, feeling the need of composing herself, took refuge for a few minutes in her own room. Her first natural sensations of surprise and excitement at the prospect of going to Venice were succeeded by impressions of a less agreeable kind. With the recovery of her customary composure came the unwelcome remembrance of the parting words spoken to her by Montbarry's widow: "We shall meet again, here in England, or there in Venice, where my husband died, and meet for the last time." It was an odd coincidence, to say the least of it, that the march of events should be unexpectedly taking Agnes to Venice, after those words had been spoken. Was the woman of the mysterious warnings and the wild black eyes still thousands of miles away in America? Or was the march of events taking her unexpectedly too on the journey to Venice? Agnes started out of her chair, ashamed of even the momentary concession to superstition which was implied by the mere presence of such questions as these in her mind. She rang the bell, and sent for her little pupils, and announced their approaching departure to the household. The noisy delight of the children, the inspiriting effort of packing up in a hurry, roused all her energies. She dismissed her own absurd misgivings from consideration with the contempt that they deserved. She worked as only women can work when their hearts are in what they do. The travellers reached Dublin that day, in time for the boat to England. 2 days later they were with Lord and Lady Montbarry at Paris. End of chapter 15. Read by Kehinde of BotTrek.com. 16. Of the Haunted Hotel. A Mystery of Modern Venice. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kehinde. The Haunted Hotel. By Wilkie Collins. Chapter 16. It was only the 20th of September when Agnes and the children reached Paris. Mrs. Norbury and her brother Francis had then already started on their journey to Italy, at least 3 weeks before the date at which the new hotel was to open for the reception of travellers. The person answerable for this premature departure was Francis Westwick. Like his younger brother Henry, he had increased his pecuniary resources by his own enterprise and ingenuity, with this difference, that his speculations were connected with the arts. He had made money in the first instance by a weekly newspaper, and he had then invested his profits in a London theatre. This latter enterprise, admirably conducted, had been rewarded by the public with steady and liberal encouragement. Pondering over a new form of theatrical attraction for the coming winter season, Francis had determined to revive the languid public taste for the ballet by means of an entertainment of his own invention, combining dramatic interest with dancing. He was now accordingly in search of the best dancer possessed of the indispensable personal attractions, who was to be found in the theatres of the Continent. Hearing from his foreign correspondents of two women who had made successful appearances, one at Milan and one at Florence, he had arranged to visit those cities and to judge of the merits of the dancers for himself, before he joined the bride and bridegroom. His widowed sister, having friends at Florence whom she was anxious to see, readily accompanied him. The Montbarrys remained at Paris until it was time to present themselves at the family meeting in Venice. Henry found them still in the French capital when he arrived from London on his way to the opening of the new hotel. Against Lady Montbarry's advice, he took the opportunity of renewing his addresses to Agnes. He could hardly have chosen a more unpropitious time for pleading his cause with her. The gaieties of Paris, quite incomprehensibly to herself as well as to everyone about her, had a depressing effect on her spirits. She had no illness to complain of; she shared willingly in the ever varying succession of amusements afforded to strangers by the ingenuity of the liveliest people in the world, but nothing roused her. She remained persistently dull and weary through it all. In this frame of mind and body she was in no humour to receive Henry's ill-timed addresses with favour, or even with patience. She plainly and positively refused to listen to him. "Why do you remind me of what I have suffered?" she asked petulantly. "Don't you see that it has left its mark on me for life?" "I thought I knew something of women by this time," Henry said, appealing privately to Lady Montbarry for consolation. "But Agnes completely puzzles me. It is a year since Montbarry's death, and she remains as devoted to his memory as if he had died faithful to her. She still feels the loss of him, as none of us feel it." "She is the truest woman that ever breathed the breath of life," Lady Montbarry answered. "Remember that, and you will understand her. Can such a woman as Agnes give her love or refuse it, according to circumstances? Because the man was unworthy of her, was he less the man of her choice? The truest and best friend to him, little as he deserved it, in his lifetime, she naturally remains the truest and best friend to his memory now. If you really love her, wait, and trust to your two best friends, to time and to me. There is my advice. Let your own experience decide whether it is not the best advice that I can offer. Resume your journey to Venice tomorrow, and when you take leave of Agnes, speak to her as cordially as if nothing had happened." Henry wisely followed this advice. Thoroughly understanding him, Agnes made the leave taking friendly and pleasant on her side. When he stopped at the door for a last look at her, she hurriedly turned her head, so that her face was hidden from him. "Was that a good sign?" Lady Montbarry, accompanying Henry down the stairs, said, "Yes, decidedly. Write when you get to Venice. We shall wait here to receive letters from Arthur and his wife, and we shall time our departure for Italy accordingly." A week passed, and no letter came from Henry. Some days later, a telegram was received from him. It was dispatched from Milan instead of from Venice, and it brought this strange message: "I have left the hotel. Will return on the arrival of Arthur and his wife. Address, meanwhile, Albergo Reale, Milan." Preferring Venice before all other cities of Europe, and having arranged to remain there until the family meeting took place, what unexpected event had led Henry to alter his plans? And why did he state the bare fact, without adding a word of explanation? Let the narrative follow him. and find the answer to those questions at Venice. End of chapter 16. Recording by Kehinde of BardTrack.com. Of the Haunted Hotel. A Mystery of Modern Venice. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kehinde. The Haunted Hotel by Wilkie Collins. Chapter 17. The Palace Hotel, appealing for encouragement mainly to English and American travellers, celebrated the opening of its doors, as a matter of course, by the giving of a grand banquet and the delivery of a long succession of speeches. Delayed on his journey, Henry Westwick only reached Venice in time to join the guests over their coffee and cigars. Observing the splendour of the reception rooms, and taking note especially of the artful mixture of comfort and luxury in the bedchambers, he began to share the old nurse's view of the future, and to contemplate seriously the coming dividend of 10%. The hotel was beginning well, at all events. So much interest in the enterprise had been aroused, at home and abroad, by profuse advertising, that the whole accommodation of the building had been secured by travellers of all nations for the opening night. Henry only obtained one of the small rooms on the upper floor by a lucky accident, the absence of the gentleman who had written to engage it. He was quite satisfied, and was on his way to bed, when another accident altered his prospects for the night, and moved him into another and a better room. Ascending on his way to the higher regions as far as the first floor of the hotel, Henry's attention was attracted by an angry voice protesting, in a strong New England accent, against one of the greatest hardships that can be inflicted on a citizen of the United States, the hardship of sending him to bed without gas in his room. The Americans are not only the most hospitable people to be found on the face of the earth, they are, under certain conditions, the most patient and good-tempered people as well. But they are human, and the limit of American endurance is found in the obsolete institution of a bedroom candle. The American traveller, in the present case, declined to believe that his bedroom was in a complete finished state without a gas burner. The manager pointed to the fine antique decorations, renewed and regilt, on the walls and the ceiling, and explained that the emanations of burning gaslight would certainly spoil them in the course of a few months. To this the traveller replied that it was possible, but that he did not understand decorations. A bedroom with gas in it was what he was used to, was what he wanted, and was what he was determined to have. The compliant manager volunteered to ask some other gentlemen, housed on the inferior upper story, which was lit throughout with gas, to change rooms. Hearing this, and being quite willing to exchange a small bedchamber for a large one, Henry volunteered to be the other gentleman. The excellent American shook hands with him on the spot. "You are a cultured person, sir," he said, "and you will no doubt understand the decorations." Henry looked at the number of the room on the door as he opened it. The number was 14. Tired and sleepy, he naturally anticipated a good night's rest. In the thoroughly healthy state of his nervous system, he slept as well in a bed abroad as in a bed at home. With the slightest assignable reason, however, his just expectations were disappointed. The luxurious bed, the well-ventilated room, the delicious tranquillity of Venice by night, all were in favour of his sleeping well. He never slept at all. An indescribable sense of depression and discomfort kept him waking through darkness and daylight alike. He went down to the coffee-room as soon as the hotel was astir, and ordered some breakfast. Another unaccountable change in himself appeared with the appearance of the meal. He was absolutely without appetite. An excellent omelette and cutlets cooked to perfection he sent away untasted. He, whose appetite never failed him, whose digestion was still equal to any demands on it. The day was bright and fine. He sent for a gondola, and was rowed to the Lido. Out on the airy lagoon he felt like a new man. He had not left the hotel 10 minutes before he was fast asleep in the gondola. Waking on reaching the landing place, he crossed the Lido and enjoyed a morning swim in the Adriatic. There was only a poor restaurant on the island in those days, but his appetite was now ready for anything. He ate whatever was offered to him like a famished man. He could hardly believe, when he reflected on it, that he had sent away untasted his excellent breakfast at the hotel. Returning to Venice, he spent the rest of the day in the picture galleries and the churches. Towards 6 o'clock, his gondola took him back, with another fine appetite, to meet some travelling acquaintances with whom he had engaged to dine at the table d'hôte. The dinner was deservedly rewarded with the highest approval by every guest in the hotel but one. To Henry's astonishment, the appetite with which he had entered the house mysteriously and completely left him when he sat down to table. He could drink some wine, but he could literally eat nothing. "What in the world is the matter with you?" his travelling acquaintances asked. He could honestly answer, "I know no more than you do." When night came, he gave his comfortable and beautiful bedroom another trial. The result of the second experiment was a repetition of the result of the first. Again he felt the all-pervading sense of depression and discomfort. Again he passed a sleepless night, and once more, when he tried to eat his breakfast, his appetite completely failed him. This personal experience of the new hotel was too extraordinary to be passed over in silence. Henry mentioned it to his friends in the public room in the hearing of the manager. The manager, naturally zealous in defence of the hotel, was a little hurt at the implied reflection cast on number 14. He invited the travellers present to judge for themselves whether Mr. Westwick's bedroom was to blame for Mr. Westwick's sleepless nights, and he especially appealed to a grey-headed gentleman, a guest at the breakfast table of an English traveller, to take the lead in the investigation. "This is Dr. Bruno, our first physician in Venice," he explained. "I appeal to him to say if there are any unhealthy influences in Mr. Westwick's room." Introduced to number 14, the doctor looked round him with a certain appearance of interest which was noticed by everyone present. "The last time I was in this room," he said, "was on a melancholy occasion. It was before the palace was changed into an hotel. I was in professional attendance on an English nobleman who died here." One of the persons present inquired the name of the nobleman. Dr. Bruno answered, without the slightest suspicion that he was speaking before a brother of the dead man, "Lord Montbarry." Henry quietly left the room without saying a word to anybody. He was not, in any sense of the term, a superstitious man. But he felt, nevertheless, an insurmountable reluctance to remaining in the hotel. He decided on leaving Venice. To ask for another room would be, as he could plainly see, an offence in the eyes of the manager. To remove to another hotel would be to openly abandon an establishment in the success of which he had a pecuniary interest. Leaving a note for Arthur Barville on his arrival in Venice, in which he merely mentioned that he had gone to look at the Italian lakes, and that a line addressed to his hotel at Milan would bring him back again, he took the afternoon train to Padua, and dined with his usual appetite, and slept as well as ever that night. The next day, a gentleman and his wife, perfect strangers to the Montbarry family, returning to England by way of Venice, arrived at the hotel and occupied number 14. Still mindful of the slur that had been cast on one of his best bedchambers, the manager took occasion to ask the travellers the next morning how they liked their room. They left him to judge for himself how well they were satisfied by remaining a day longer in Venice than they had originally planned to do, solely for the purpose of enjoying the excellent accommodation offered to them by the new hotel. "We have met with nothing like it in Italy," they said. You may rely on our recommending you to all our friends." On the day when number 14 was again vacant, an English lady travelling alone with her maid arrived at the hotel, saw the room, and at once engaged it. The lady was Mrs. Norbury. She had left Francis Westwick at Milan, occupied in negotiating for the appearance at his theatre of the new dancer at the Scala. Not having heard to the contrary, Mrs. Norbury supposed that Arthur Barville and his wife had already arrived at Venice. She was more interested in meeting the young married couple than in awaiting the result of the hard bargaining which delayed the engagement of the new dancer, and she volunteered to make her brother's apologies if his theatrical business caused him to be late in keeping his appointment at the honeymoon festival. Mrs. Norbury's experience of number 14 differed entirely from her brother Henry's experience of the room. Falling asleep as readily as usual, her repose was disturbed by a succession of frightful dreams, the central figure in every one of them being the figure of her dead brother, the first Lord Montbarry. She saw him starving in a loathsome prison. She saw him pursued by assassins, and dying under their knives. She saw him drowning in immeasurable depths of dark water. She saw him in a bed on fire, burning to death in the flames. She saw him tempted by a shadowy creature to drink, and dying of the poisonous draught. The reiterated horror of these dreams had such an effect on her that she rose with the dawn of day, afraid to trust herself again in bed. In the old times she had been noted in the family as the one member of it who lived on affectionate terms with Montbarry. His other sister and his brothers were constantly quarrelling with him. Even his mother owned that her eldest son was of all her children the child whom she least liked. Sensible and resolute woman as she was, Mrs. Norbury shuddered with terror as she sat at the window of her room, watching the sunrise and thinking of her dreams. She made the first excuse that occurred to her when her maid came in at the usual hour and noticed how ill she looked. The woman was of so superstitious a temperament that it would have been in the last degree indiscreet to trust her with the truth. Mrs. Norbury merely remarked that she had not found the bed quite to her liking, on account of the large size of it. She was accustomed at home, as her maid knew, to sleep in a small bed. Informed of this objection later in the day, the manager regretted that he could only offer to the lady the choice of one other bedchamber, numbered 38, and situated immediately over the bedchamber which she desired to leave. Mrs. Norbury accepted the proposed change of quarters. She was now about to pass her second night in the room occupied in the old days of the palace by Baron Rivar. Once more she fell asleep as usual, and once more the frightful dreams of the first night terrified her, following each other in the same succession. This time her nerves, already shaken, were not equal to the renewed torture of terror inflicted on them. She threw on her dressing gown and rushed out of her room in the middle of the night. The porter, alarmed by the banging of the door, met her hurrying headlong down the stairs, in search of the first human being she could find to keep her company. Considerably surprised at this last new manifestation of the famous English eccentricity, the man looked at the hotel register and led the lady upstairs again to the room occupied by her maid. The maid was not asleep, and, more wonderful still, was not even undressed. She received her mistress quietly. When they were alone, and when Mrs. Norbury had, as a matter of necessity, taken her attendant into her confidence, the woman made a very strange reply. "I have been asking about the hotel at the servants' supper to night," she said. "The valet of one of the gentlemen staying here has heard that the late Lord Montbarry was the last person who lived in the palace, before it was made into an hotel. The room he died in, ma'am, was the room you slept in last night. Your room to night is the room just above it. I said nothing for fear of frightening you. For my own part, I have passed the night, as you see, keeping my light on and reading my Bible. In my opinion, no member of your family can hope to be happy or comfortable in this house." "What do you mean?" "Please to let me explain myself, ma'am. When Mr. Henry Westwick was here I have this from the valet too he occupied the room his brother died in, without knowing it, like you. For 2 nights he never closed his eyes. Without any reason for it, the valet heard him tell the gentleman in the coffee room he could not sleep. He felt so low and so wretched in himself. And what is more, when daytime came, he couldn't even eat while he was under this roof. You may laugh at me, ma'am, but even a servant may draw her own conclusions. It is my conclusion that something happened to my lord which we none of us know about, when he died in this house. His ghost walks in torment until he can tell it, and the living persons related to him are the persons who feel he is near them. Those persons may yet see him in the time to come. Don't, pray don't, stay any longer in this dreadful place. I wouldn't stay another night here myself, no, not for anything that could be offered me." Mrs. Norbury at once set her servant's mind at ease on this last point. "I don't think about it as you do," she said gravely, "but I should like to speak to my brother of what has happened. We will go back to Milan." Some hours necessarily elapsed before they could leave the hotel by the first train in the forenoon. In that interval Mrs. Norbury's maid found an opportunity of confidentially informing the valet of what had passed between her mistress and herself. The valet had other friends to whom he related the circumstances in his turn. In due course of time the narrative, passing from mouth to mouth, reached the ears of the manager. He instantly saw that the credit of the hotel was in danger, unless something was done to retrieve the character of the room numbered 14. English travellers, well acquainted with the peerage of their native country, informed him that Henry Westwick and Mrs. Norbury were by no means the only members of the Montbarry family. Curiosity might bring more of them to the hotel, after hearing what had happened. The manager's ingenuity easily hit on the obvious means of misleading them in this case. The numbers of all the rooms were enamelled in blue on white china plates screwed to the doors. He ordered a new plate to be prepared bearing the number 13A, and he kept the room empty, after its tenant for the time being had gone away, until the plate was ready. He then renumbered the room, placing the removed number 14 on the door of his own room on the second floor, which, not being to let, had not previously been numbered at all. By this device, number 14 disappeared at once and for ever from the books of the hotel as the number of a bedroom to let. Having warned the servants to beware of gossiping with travellers on the subject of the changed numbers, under penalty of being dismissed, the manager composed his mind with the reflection that he had done his duty to his employers. Now, he thought to himself, with an excusable sense of triumph, let the whole family come here if they like. The hotel is a match for them. End of chapter 17. Read by Kehinde of Bahatrack.com. Of the Haunted Hotel. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kehinde. The Haunted Hotel, A Mystery of Modern Venice, by Wilkie Collins. Chapter 18. Before the end of the week the manager found himself in relations with the family once more. A telegram from Milan announced that Mr. Francis Westwick would arrive in Venice on the next day, and would be obliged if number 14 on the first floor could be reserved for him in the event of its being vacant at the time. The manager paused to consider before he issued his directions. The renumbered room had been last let to a French gentleman. It would be occupied on the day of Mr. Francis Westwick's arrival, but it would be empty again on the day after. Would it be well to reserve the room for the special occupation of Mr. Francis? And when he had passed the night unsuspiciously and comfortably in number 13A, to ask him in the presence of witnesses how he liked his bedchamber. In this case, if the reputation of the room happened to be called in question again, the answer would vindicate it on the evidence of a member of the very family which had first given number 14 a bad name. After a little reflection, the manager decided on trying the experiment, and directed that 13A should be reserved accordingly. On the next day Francis Westwick arrived in excellent spirits. He had signed agreements with the most popular dancer in Italy, he had transferred the charge of Mrs. Norbury to his brother Henry, who had joined him in Milan, and he was now at full liberty to amuse himself by testing in every possible way the extraordinary influence exercised over his relatives by the new hotel. When his brother and sister first told him what their experience had been, he instantly declared that he would go to Venice in the interest of his theatre. The circumstances related to him contained invaluable hints for a ghost drama. The title occurred to him in the railway, The Haunted Hotel. Post that in red letters 6 feet high on a black ground all over London, and trust the excitable public to crowd into the theatre. Received with the politest attention by the manager, Francis met with a disappointment on entering the hotel. "Some mistake, sir. No such room on the first floor as number 14. The room bearing that number is on the second floor, and has been occupied by me from the day when the hotel opened. Perhaps you meant number 13A on the first floor. It will be at your service tomorrow. A charming room. In the meantime we will do the best we can for you tonight." A man who is the successful manager of a theatre is probably the last man in the civilized universe who is capable of being impressed with the favourable opinions of his fellow creatures. Francis privately set the manager down as a humbug, and the story about the numbering of the rooms as a lie. On the day of his arrival he dined by himself in the restaurant before the hour of the table d'hote, for the express purpose of questioning the waiter, without being overheard by anybody. The answer led him to the conclusions that 13A occupied the situation in the hotel which had been described by his brother and sister as the situation of 14. He asked next for the visitors' list, and found that the French gentleman who then occupied 13A was the proprietor of a theatre in Paris personally well known to him. Was the gentleman then in the hotel? He had gone out, but would certainly return for the table d'hote. When the public dinner was over, Francis entered the room, and was welcomed by his Parisian colleague literally with open arms. "Come and have a cigar in my room," said the friendly Frenchman. "I want to hear whether you have really engaged that woman at Milan or not." In this easy way Francis found his opportunity of comparing the interior of the room with the description which he had heard of it at Milan. Arriving at the door, the Frenchman bethought himself of his travelling companion. "My scene painter is here with me," he said, "on the lookout for materials. An excellent fellow, who will take it as a kindness if we ask him to join us. I'll tell the porter to send him up when he comes in." He handed the key of his room to Francis. "I will be back in a minute. It's at the end of the corridor, 13A." Francis entered the room alone. There were the decorations on the walls and the ceiling, exactly as they had been described to him. He had just time to perceive this at a glance before his attention was diverted to himself and his own sensations by a grotesquely disagreeable occurrence which took him completely by surprise. He became conscious of a mysteriously offensive odour in the room, entirely new in his experience of revolting smells. It was composed, if such a thing could be, of two mingling exhalations, which were separately discoverable exhalations nevertheless. This strange blending of odours consisted of something faintly and unpleasantly aromatic, mixed with another underlying smell, so unutterably sickening that he threw open the door and put his head out into the fresh air, unable to endure the horribly infected atmosphere for a moment longer. The French proprietor joined his English friend with his cigar already lit. He started back in dismay at a sight terrible to his countrymen in general, the sight of an open window. "You English people are perfectly mad on the subject of fresh air," he exclaimed. "We shall catch our deaths of cold." Francis turned and looked at him in astonishment. "Are you really not aware of the smell there is in the room?" he asked. "Smell?" repeated his brother manager. "I smell my own good cigar. Try one yourself, and for heaven's sake shut the window." Francis declined the cigar by a sign. "Forgive me," he said. "I will leave you to close the window. I feel faint and giddy. I had better go out." He put his handkerchief over his nose and mouth, and crossed the room to the door. The Frenchman followed the movements of Francis in such a state of bewilderment that he actually forgot to seize the opportunity of shutting out the fresh air. "Is it so nasty as that?" he asked, with a broad stare of amazement. "Horrible!" Francis muttered behind his handkerchief. "I never smelt anything like it in my life." There was a knock at the door. The scene painter appeared. His employer instantly asked him if he smelt anything. "I smell your cigar. Delicious. Give me one directly." "Wait a minute. Besides my cigar, do you smell anything else? Vile, abominable, overpowering, indescribable, never smelt before?" The scene painter appeared to be puzzled by the vehement energy of the language addressed to him. "The room is as fresh and sweet as a room can be," he answered. As he spoke, he looked back with astonishment at Francis Westwick, standing outside in the corridor, and eyeing the interior of the bedchamber with an expression of undisguised disgust. The Parisian director approached his English colleague, and looked at him with grave and anxious scrutiny. "You see, my friend, here are two of us with as good noses as yours, who smell nothing. If you want evidence for more noses, look there." He pointed to two little English girls at play in the corridor. "The door of my room is wide open, and you know how fast a smell can travel. Now listen, while I appeal to these innocent noses in the language of their own dismal island. My little loves, do you sniff a nasty smell here, huh?" The children burst out laughing, and answered emphatically, "No." "My good Westwick," the Frenchman resumed in his own language, "the conclusion is surely plain. There is something wrong, very wrong, with your own nose. I recommend you to see a medical man." Having given that advice, he returned to his room and shut out the horrid fresh air with a loud exclamation of relief. Francis left the hotel by the lanes that led to the square of St. Mark. The night breeze soon revived him. He was able to light a cigar, and to think quietly over what had happened. End of chapter 18. Read by Kehinde of podtrek.com.